I'm going to ask Sarah to introduce herself in a minute, but I thought I'd just share a little anecdote. Sarah and I have a series of coincidences in our lives. We grew up about 10 minutes apart in these tiny towns in Vermont. Somehow both, through circuitous means, arrived at Stanford together. And then we wound up living about 200 feet apart in Menlo Park. So we've been friends and colleagues for a long time. And Sarah, it's such a delight to welcome you to BreakLine. Thank you so much for joining us. And as we get started, the folks on the line have all seen your bio and your background, but would love for you to share a little bit with our community, a little bit about your career and your life.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bethany. And everything Bethany said about us having these wonderfully intertwined coincidental lives is true. And I'm, honored and always very, very happy when I get a chance to spend some time with Bethany. And I'm also, I must say, very honored to be able to have a chance to speak with all of you. It goes without saying, and I always say when I'm speaking to veterans, thank you. Thank you for everything that you have done for our country, that you continually do for our country, and the honor is really all mine, 100%. So, as Bethany said, I'm a professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. I'm also now currently on the leadership team for the school. And what I oversee at the school presently is our executive education department. I oversee a couple of academic areas. And importantly, for some of what we're going to be talking about today, I oversee our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts for the entire school. And so that's all to say that I'm very busy these days and hoping that we can, as a school, craft a strategy and think really intentionally about what we can do around diversity, equity, and inclusion broadly, but more specifically to think about what we can do as a school, as educators of leaders, to deal with and think about ways to eradicate the incredible racial injustices in our society, and to think about ways that we can craft leaders who take that as their personal mission when they leave the school to do more around anti-racism and to think about how they can craft their leadership as allyship. So that's a little bit about me.
So Sarah and I are going to cover a range of topics and under the umbrella headline of inclusive leadership in turbulent times. And so it's so wonderful, Sarah, to have you with us, given your research, given your current set of responsibilities and the classes that you teach at Stanford. We're really happy to have the opportunity to learn from you. And I wanted to kick things off right away for our community here at BreakLine. Can you talk to us a little bit? We're in this moment where we have 3 overlapping crises in this country and really largely all around the world. But can you talk a little bit about the impact of these overlapping crises on employees and how these impacts are experienced differently, perhaps by gender and by race?
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of, I think what I'll say about this may be obvious, but I think that it's incredibly important to call this out. As Bethany said, we have this sort of trifecta of crises right now. And this is causing us, I think, to think very deeply about issues related to inequality. And I mean that in the society at large, but I also mean that for our employees at our organizations, our employees on our teams, because as you probably know, our employees are experiencing these crises in very different ways. So when we think about these crises, we can think about, of course, the incredible loss of life to this virus. I think the last number that I saw for the United States was over 120,000 people who have died from this. Globally, obviously much, much more. We can think about the loss of jobs that we've experienced here in the United States and abroad. And then, of course, as Bethany was sort of referring to, we can think about the way in which the protests in our country are shining a light on existing racial inequities and injustices in our society. And because most of us have diverse workplaces, we have employees that we lead who are experiencing these crises in very, very different ways. We can think about, for example, the way in which gender intersects with the experience of working from home. Many of us who have employees who are working mothers are managing right now a lot. They're managing, of course, working from home. They're managing household responsibilities and then educational responsibilities for their children on top of everything else that they're dealing with, looking out into reading the news and worrying about becoming ill and worrying about what else is happening. When we think about race, if you've been following very carefully some of the racialized patterns of deaths to this virus, you'll notice that something like 33% of the deaths have been African Americans, which is more than double the proportion of African Americans in the United States. And we can talk a little bit about why that comes to be, because it's, of course, taps into and allows us a lens to think about systemic racism in our country and how this has come to be the case. Similarly, at least here in the Bay Area, Latinx people are suffering, having higher than their rates of the populations of hospitalizations for COVID-19. So a lot of our Black and Brown employees are experiencing this pandemic in different ways as they're watching and seeing what's happening. We can think also about thinking about the loss of jobs and where those jobs have been lost. Many of the jobs, you've heard the term, or maybe you've heard the term, she-cession that we're in, because many of the people who are losing jobs are women who work in service sector kinds of jobs. Not all, obviously, but it's certainly the loss of jobs is also impacting our Black and Brown employees in different, and friends and community members in different ways. So all of this means that I think the amount of stress that people are under right now at work has been amplified. There have been some studies that have come out earlier in the pandemic that are saying that something like over a third of Americans are experiencing some kind of mental health crisis as a result of that was the pandemic and the recession. And now we add in the what we're seeing in terms of how the protests are shining a light on racial inequities in our country. And I think we need to think about ways to support our employees in ways that they will be able to come out of these crises and hopefully become even better employees and better leaders of our organizations, because we're going to need them to be such.
Thank you, Sarah. And I want to talk more about that. How we really build and support leaders who can help drive that recovery in a number of different respects. And as we segue into that, perhaps you can share with us the GSB's approach to leadership and what that rubric looks like. What does that leadership model look like from Stanford's perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Bethany. So, the GSB, Graduate School of Business, one of the things that we sort of pride ourselves on is having a robust leadership curriculum. And part of the reason that I use the word robust is that we have a model of leadership that is based in science. It's based in research. And I'm going to talk to you about what the competencies are that we teach at the school in just a minute. But I think part of why we are sort of known for this at the GSB is that our students come to us because, yes, they want to learn the fundamentals of finance and accounting and strategy, but they really want to come to us because they want to develop and grow as leaders. And so this leadership model, and then I want to talk a little bit about how we can think about using this as a framework as we think about rebuilding and also as we think about supporting our employees at the moment. So the first aspect of the leadership model, the first competency, as we call it, is self-awareness. And based on a lot of research about what makes people better leaders and better team members, self-awareness is one piece of this. So taking time, a practice of being aware of how it is that you show up in any given interaction with the team that you lead. Spending time thinking about and being aware of such things as your own mental state in any given interaction with people, your own communication pattern, the way that you are, again, as I said, sort of showing up in a given situation. So that's the first, self-awareness. The second is perspective taking, and it's almost as if that's the flip side, or it's the other side of the coin. And perspective taking in its core is compassion and paying attention to where other people are at a given moment. How is it that they're experiencing you, for example? How is it that they're experiencing this situation? And I'll come back a lot to perspective taking, because I think in this sort of trifecta of crises, thinking, really exercising a lot of perspective taking can help us and help us support our employees and the people around us. So perspective taking is the second piece of this. The third, also equally important in the particular situation that we're in right now, is context. And context is nothing more than really just being aware of what's going on around you and other people in any given interaction that you're having with other people. Now that may seem a little, wait, what does that mean exactly? But I'll give you a perfect example, because this has become so important now as we think about how we are working now. Most of us are working from home, working out of perhaps a corner in our living room if you're me, or working out of your car if you don't have good internet and you have to go find internet and work someplace. I have employees that are sitting in their cars working right now so they can get decent internet, these kinds of things. Being aware of the context that right now we're working virtually. And how is it that we interact differently on Zoom or on Skype or on FaceTime than we do when we're together at the office? That's one really, I think, kind of poignant example right now of context. So self-awareness, perspective taking, awareness of the context are the first three. Then the fourth one has to do with communication. And right now, as I'm sure you're all spending more time communicating, and probably should be even spending more time communicating with the people with whom you work, the people you work for, the people you work with, and who work for you. Because right now, we're not having our chance interactions bumping into each other in the place of work. We're not having the minute-long conversation near the coffee pot or walking from meeting to meeting. And so we need to make sure that we're communicating effectively. That's one piece of it. But then, of course, also when we think about crisis and crisis communications, there's an art to this, and we are in need of very good communication skills right now in the moment. And then the last is decision-making. And I don't want to speak for anybody, but I know that a lot of the leaders that I've been talking to over the last 2 or 3 months have felt like they're experiencing something they've never experienced before, which is they have rapid decisions that they must make, and the possible options are all terrible. And so some decision has to be made, and it has to be made quickly without a lot of information amongst options that are just really, really suboptimal in so many different ways. And so all of these, I think, have come to a head as we think about leaders and leading through these turbulent times right now. And we need a model, and we need some competencies to fall back on so that we can assess how we're doing in this moment. And so I think that the leadership model, I can say a little bit more about some of these, because I want to talk about them specifically applied to how do we support our people right now? How do we support the people we work with right now? But I think having, sort of 5 sets of competencies to think about can help us as leaders to benchmark how we're doing, basically. So I'll say a couple of things about what I like to call inclusive leadership right now, with the way in which our employees and our team members are experiencing these crises. We need support, and we need to support the people who work for us more than ever. And I already mentioned that some of the data on the sort of mental health crisis that is occurring right now in the United States, that's part of it. But then, of course, there are all of the more technical crises that we that our employees may be having, such as my employee who's working in her car so that she has better internet than she's, borrowing from Starbucks or wherever she's borrowing it. But and a couple of things, I think. I mean, one is obvious. Some of these, like I said, are technical, making sure that all of the people who work with us have equal access to the technology that they need to be working from home. Most organizations have sorted that out by now, but if you were in a position in, say, March or earlier, when you suddenly realized that the people with whom you work were going to be sent home to work, there was a mad scramble, and many of us remember that all too well. And some of us, like myself, are still a little traumatized by how are we going to get laptops to all of these people who are not allowed to step foot on campus? How's that going to happen? So these technical kinds of things. Thinking about ways when you're on a Zoom call or a Skype call to make sure that it's accessible to everybody by either closed captioning or sending documents beforehand, Google Docs or some sharing documents, so that people who may have trouble with internet, may not be able to get into the call other than by phone for whatever reason, will not feel left out. One of the things that we teach when we teach virtual groups and teams is that we must try, and you saw Casey and Bethany do this, to ask everybody to be on video. It's easier when everybody's on video. It's very hard, and I know we're all experiencing this when somebody calls in. The person who calls in often isn't seen and isn't heard. And so thinking about how to make that more inclusive, and there are going to be people who can't be on video. And so figuring out ways that they can feel included in the conversation, remembered in the conversation, and contribute to the conversation by sharing materials beforehand, for example. I think similarly, acknowledging everybody in the room, right? I think there's this tendency often in these virtual meetings for somebody to acknowledge, the highest ranking person in the room. But making sure that everybody in the room, the meeting room, the Zoom call, feels included in various ways by, the sort of chit chat at the beginning of the Zoom call, checking in, asking questions, and seeing how people are feeling. Having empathy, and this is, I think, the compassionate piece and the perspective taking for people who are likely experiencing this pandemic in different ways. So I mean parents. I mean people who have elder care issues, perhaps, or elderly loved ones who they're not able to be with at the moment. Thinking about ways in which we can be inclusive of our Black and Brown employees in ways that I hope we were doing before, but it's even more important right now. Thinking about ways to support our Asian American colleagues who may be witnessing microaggressions, might be witnessing and hearing people, blame, in particular China, for this virus. Thinking about ways that we can support people who are being who are being targeted right now in racialized sorts of ways, checking in with them. And I think the perspective taking, and then is so key here. And then self-awareness too. As leaders, as people who are leading teams and leading organizations, making sure that you're spending time checking in with yourself and making sure that you're doing okay. Because if you are the sort of heroic leader that is not taking time to check in with yourself and not taking time for self-care, this looks like this is going to be a marathon right now. And we wish this would all end soon, but we all need to be very careful and cautious that we're looking inwardly and being very self-aware. So that's how I sort of like to think. I think that was a little bit rambling in many ways and not very organized answer, Bethany, but I think having a framework and thinking about self-awareness, perspective taking, awareness of the context, thinking about communication and communicating very clearly during a crisis and checking in with people more than maybe we ordinarily would, super important. And then the decision making, thinking about how we can make the best decisions, take the best decisions we possibly can, even when we're forced to make decisions between 2 or 3 suboptimal options. So I hope that helps you think about and gives you a way of thinking about how you can more effectively lead and do so in an inclusive way during these incredibly just unbelievable times that we're in.
Yeah. Sarah, I love this framework. And part of the reason why I love it is because it's something that we can all kind of grab onto right now and use as a way of organizing ourselves, organizing our teams and our priorities. So I appreciate you sharing it. And in particular, I really perked up with the compassion element of it with perspective taking, because I think, you know, we're all in crisis. Every single person on this call is affected by at least one of these crises. Multiple people are affected by all three of them, and it can be hard in that environment to then also be compassionate. But it's so important to really be able to involve other people in our day-to-day lives and show up for other people. So thank you for that reminder. I wanted to hear a little bit more. The other thing that I was thinking about was you mentioned decision making, and at BreakLine we talk a lot about how we want our community to always be in a position to choose from attractive alternatives.
Yes.
And you were talking about the fact that we're in this moment of time when people have to make rapid decisions from terrible alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
Are you all seeing anything at Stanford with regard to like when that's the case and all the options are bad? How do you choose the best one from that array? Have you seen
Yes.
anything around that?
Are you talking about seeing literature around it or how to do it, or am I seeing it happen?
How do we, yeah, I mean, either, like, but have you thought further about when the options are all bad? How do you
Yes.
choose the least bad one?
Yeah. So I think it's a great question, because I've been thinking so much about this, because again, as part of the leadership team at the GSB, you know, when this started, it really, I can't even express how terrible it was. Are we going to, turn on a dime and all of our classes are going to be, which we did, by the way, over a weekend? Everything is now going to be online for the final week of the winter quarter. We had to make that decision on a Friday night at about midnight, and be ready to execute on Monday morning. And the alternative is we send people into the classroom and somebody gets sick. That can't happen either. So, we lived that, and I suspect many people on the webinar lived that. I think what we did, and I'm going to lean back again on the leadership model, was being very good about taking perspective and asking as many people as possible, how is this going to impact this student group? How is this going to impact and checking in with people? Because one of the things that we learned, and this is, I sort of mentioned this when thinking about public school education and primary or K through 12 education, some of the inequalities there, but even at Stanford University, we had to think very carefully, what about our international students? They may not be able to go home, go to their home country, and if they do, are they going to be able to come back? So if we tell people they're moving all education online, we need to make sure that we have a place for our international students to stay on campus, a safe place where they will not get sick. One of the issues that people are, I'm sure, aware of is that dormitories can be very difficult if somebody is ill and there's shared bedrooms and shared restrooms and so on. That is a very it's a suboptimal situation for our students. So we had to think, how are we going to be sure that we are keeping our community healthy? How are we going to be sure that for students who maybe don't have a home to go to, so aside from the international students, what about students who came from backgrounds where they can't go home for whatever reason? How are we going to make sure that they're taken care of? And so we had to spend a lot of time asking questions and perspective taking and thinking about this issue from so many different angles. And I think, as a result, the decision is better, even though, none of us wanted to move all of our classes online over the course of the weekend, but we had to think about ways to do that with the least amount of harm and the most amount of compassion for our various student groups.
Sarah, in listening to that example, it was reminding me of the 3 C's. So you all were comprehensive, consultative, and compassionate. So when we're choosing from tough alternatives, that gives us a potential approach for thinking about it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Sarah, we're starting to get some questions from our audience, and one of them is aligned with the example that you just gave. So thinking about the perspective of all of Stanford students and what it might mean for some of them when education moves to a remote construct.
Mm-hmm.
And Eric Gonzalez says, how does Stanford approach reaching underrepresented communities, specifically those with a lack of broadband access?
Yes.
So when your students go home and some of them don't have access to these tools,
Mm-hmm.
how do we make sure that they're getting an equitable education?
Yeah, Eric, that's a great question. We thought so much about that. I'll tell you how we solved it. We solved it by if a student was a student in that situation and said, I can't go home, I don't have broadband at home, again, international or domestic, because this exists in both of our international and domestic students, we made a dorm room available for them. And how we did it, so Bethany knows this because of the GSB, our MBA dorms, we were so lucky, our MBA dorms have they're single rooms with their own bathrooms. And so our dorm, the MBA dorm, because many of our MBA students went home or went elsewhere, our dorm became the dorm for all of the students who didn't have a place to go, essentially. And that felt good, honestly, for me, for the GSB, to know that they were safe, to know that that they were getting food delivered to their rooms, because of course they couldn't go out and go shopping for most anyway. So it made that's how we dealt with that, and that's how we will continue to deal with it, because we have to make sure that that our students are able to get the same education. Our students who need resources are getting the same education that our more affluent students who are able to go home to their parents, or rent an Airbnb or do whatever they did to work through this crisis. Great question, Eric. Thank you.
Sarah, I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then I want to also get to some of the other questions that are coming in now, because they're all really interesting. I want to pivot just a little bit, and for all of you on the line, Sarah has done a ton of research over many years into different types of protests and movements, and what those outcomes have become. And so you, Sarah, in the process, the course of your research, you've studied a phenomenon that you call protesting while Black. Can you talk a little bit about that research and what needs to happen in our country to move to a more equitable society?
Yes, sure. This is such a, sometimes in a researcher's career, you write a paper because you were interested in the topic, and then 10 years later, a wave of protest, in this case, like we haven't seen in a very, very long time, suddenly your research, which appeared in an academic journal and nobody paid much attention to, suddenly people are paying attention to it. And so it's gratifying in some ways. But the research that we conducted was historical research, and it was on the period in the United States of 1960 to 1995. And we collected a database of about 24,000 protest events that took place all over the United States during that period. And one of the things, we've done many studies on protest from that, but one of the things that we were really interested in was looking at this phenomenon that's in the title of the paper, Protesting While Black, and the question of whether or not Black protesters are more likely to be arrested by police, more likely to be beaten by police, killed by police, controlling for all of the kinds of activities that protesters may take part in. So controlling for violence and throwing things and starting fires and looting, all of the things that can conceivably happen at a protest event. If we control for those, all things equal, is a white protester less likely or more likely to be arrested than a Black protester, arrested, beaten, and so on. And what we found in this paper was that in most years, but not all, in most years, there was a pretty substantial difference between white and Black protesters, again, controlling for behaviors. And that's the important piece here, where Black protesters were far more likely to be arrested, beaten, killed than white protesters were. And this came, we started thinking about this, of course, not surprisingly, in the recent protest wave. And it came to my mind most, and many of you will remember that in the early part of the protest wave, in Minneapolis, a CNN reporter, a Black Latinx man, was arrested when the rest of his team, he had a multiracial team, the rest of whom were white, were not arrested and hassled. So a lot of people seized on this moment or this particular event because of both thinking about the way in which journalists in general have been targeted and arrested at rates that have been disturbing to some people, but then in particular in this particular incident that was pretty widely publicized because he was a CNN or is a CNN reporter, that there was this what looked to be like clear racial differences in how the police treated the CNN reporter. And so this has come up, and we've talked about this in some blog posts and so on that we've been working on. And the other thing that I think that I wanted to sort of mention or come back to, Bethany, you asked the question of what needs to happen in our society. And, as we all have been watching these protest events, and there have been calls for police reform, and there are certainly, I think, some certain police departments and areas that empirically have been shown to treat different groups differently. And that's I think calling for police reform in various ways is of course important. But what I worry when we think about that is that people may stop at police reform as opposed to thinking more broadly. And this is what I'm trying to push people to think about. Yes, these protests are about the killing of George Floyd and other African Americans and Latinx people in our country. Yes, these protests are about that by police. But they're also about systemic racism and how we got to that point. And I think this will be a missed opportunity if we don't, as a society, begin to really ask the tougher questions. I mean, police reform is a tough question, don't get me wrong, but we ask the even tougher questions about privilege. We ask the tougher questions about why is there inequity in terms of access to healthcare, which is part of, when we look at the disparity in COVID-19 cases and deaths in particular, part of that has to do with healthcare. Why is there inequity in terms of access to education? And how have we failed so much as a country is really what we need to begin to ask. And those questions are much, much harder, and they require us to look inwardly, and they require us to look outwardly, and they require really a movement of movements is what I've been sort of calling it, because it's not just about police reform. Police reform has become a lens that I hope we will be able to, as a country, use to look even deeper at the larger issues.
Yeah, and I have one more question along these lines, Sarah, and then I'm going to turn it over to the BreakLine community. But as I was thinking about this conversation, I was thinking about different protests that we've seen in the United States over time, and what I could discern as the presence or lack thereof of really concrete outcomes that happened as a result of these movements. And so there's one example, which was Fight for 15, which was the nationwide protests for a minimum wage of $15, which I could see really substantive outcomes there within specific jurisdictions, within specific companies. And then as a contrast to that, Occupy Wall Street. To me, I don't even remember what that was specifically about, and I certainly can't point to something tangible that resulted from that. And so I'm just wondering, how can we make sure that there are lasting, concrete outcomes from the Black Lives Matter movement? What have you seen to be really crucial when we look at something through that lens? So like, what is actually going to change?
Yeah. I think that's great. And I think it's a great question. And I think your example and examples are a perfect contrast, if you will. And so I want to say a couple of things about it. In some of my work, I refer to this sort of paradox of hybridity, is what I call it. And Occupy was a really good example of the paradox of hybridity. And what I mean by that is these kinds of umbrella movements that become almost a way for lots of different groups and social movement organizations and nonprofits to kind of attach themselves to, is really terrific for building large protest events that last over many, many days. This is a great, people identify with some part of the issue. Sometimes when I talk about this in my talks, professional talks, I have these great photos that I took at an Occupy protest, which had all kinds of signs about, animal rights and the rights of honeybees and all kinds of things, which are all interesting issues that maybe we care about, but it was not really necessarily tied directly to the sort of core issue of Occupy being income inequality in the country. So it's great about bringing people together, but per your other example, Bethany, about the Fight for 15, is there wasn't a concrete singular ask or goal. And as a result, we see maybe more diffuse things happening as a result of Occupy, but not something we can point to. And in the case of the Fight for 15, there's a very concrete ask. And then there's something else. So that's one piece of this, a concrete ask. That the research that we've done shows that is much more likely to get response, lawmaker response, congressional response, and so on. It may not build as vast a movement, as coalition of a movement, but it's more likely to get an outcome. So I think organizers need to really think about that paradox of hybridity. But the second thing that we might think about too is the sort of presence of elite allies and others that are going to shepherd this movement along. And I could be wrong, but I think the Fight for 15, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, I think part of what was so successful there is that organizations, companies, decided voluntarily that they were going to raise what they were paying people and raise minimum wage to a living wage and so on. And I think that also helped a lot too, because when you see sort of corporate pressure being put on a movement, and a legislative movement in particular, that can be actually really helpful too. So it's almost as if you have activists and companies aligned, not all companies, but some companies aligned in ways that helps. And we see that also when we think about various legislative movements, something that we find a lot in our research. I've done some research on the Equal Rights Amendment and other movements, when there are people in the governing bodies who are sympathetic and can help shepherd some of the issues through the complicated policy process that we have here in this country, it can be very helpful too. So I think there's a way in which multiple pressure points can help, and multiple different pressure points can help with any sort of movement. So one of the things that I think we see right now with the current movement is unbelievable pressure coming from all over. And that to me is multiple pressure points. It gives me great optimism that there may be some change. What we need to be careful about is not squandering this opportunity at this time, that we need to continue to press forth and to ask for concrete goals and concrete outcomes as a result of this. And I think we see this certainly, and I'm guessing most of your organizations, most of the folks on the calls, organizations are seeing this too. Employees are asking, and let's be clear, not just Black employees, white employees on behalf of their Black colleagues are asking for various kinds of, whether it's training programs or whether it's other kinds of concessions. So we're seeing this in organizations, we're seeing this at the legislative level, and we're seeing this coming from multiple points and allies in a way that I think has a real potential for some change. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sarah. So the two keys there are the concrete asks, really specific asks, and then building coalitions to support. So yes. It's both, the people, the communities who are experiencing the crisis, experiencing the discrimination in this regard, and their allies coming together to create change. Thank you, Sarah. I want to go to some of the questions that we're getting from the BreakLiners here. And one of them is from Jessica Barr, who's one of our partners at Palantir. And she says she wanted to follow up on Eric Gonzalez's question. And she says, in the same vein of Eric's question, when remote workspaces are inequitable, how do you measure someone's performance when their baselines are really different. And I have a personal anecdote here, which is, Sarah, I mean, you know, I have 4 kids, steaming hot mess in the Coates Anderson household right now. It is scary. And I'm in a borrowed office right now because my home life is insane. My computer is balanced on a Pampers box. So like when I see these pristine white offices and everything is calm and orderly, that is not my life. So I like, and I think our BreakLine, some of our BreakLine teammates are here like babies and just, you know, we're all just trying to make it work, but it's not straightforward and easy. And yet there's like a much bigger spectrum of how much harder that can get. So I think this is a great question from Jessica, knowing that we have different stresses and pressures, and it can make it quite a bit harder to be productive from home. How do we really show up for our colleagues and support as a team?
Yeah, this is, you know, Jessica, I love this question. It's like the $1 million question. All of us, I think, are probably grappling with this for the exact same reasons that, you know, Bethany articulated, whether it's working parents, whether it's broadband in, you know, troubles, whether it's people living in very, very small quarters in New York or in San Francisco and bumbling over each other, you know, like nobody has a place to work. I love, Bethany told me about the Pampers box, and I told her that my office is a 1970s TV tray that I bought at a garage sale. And, you know, I'm going to have some serious need for some alignment in my back and shoulders when this thing's over. But I think, you know, the first step probably, Jessica, is that, you know, joking aside, I think the first step is we have to recognize this. We have to recognize that not only are we all experiencing and our employees experiencing this differently in terms of their stress level and what's going on in their lives and all of that, but we have to begin to recognize that that is going to have effects on performance. And in some ways, you know, it's like, I want to just give everybody a pass. We're just doing our best. There was a great quote, which is, we're not working from home. We're at home working during a pandemic, and we're forced to do this. And so we've got to adjust our expectations on what people are doing. And I think by taking perspective and by being compassionate with the people that we work, that's the first step. Now, that's easy for us to say and much harder to do when we have processes that are in place in our organizations for measuring performance as if we were all in our offices or place of work doing what we always do. And so, you know, I think the first step is absolutely being aware of this and beginning to try to figure out ways to measure performance based not necessarily on, are they on the Zoom calls with, you know, their hair combed, or are they on, you know, the phone, but trying to figure out how we can look at the results, because I think, I mean, that those may also change, and they may also be different, but we need to focus a lot more on the results that people are able to deliver. You know, this comes up a lot, Jessica and others too right now. One of the things that happened at university, so our tenure system is such that, you know, people have 7 years to produce enough body of work and teach well enough that they're judged by outside reviewers to achieve tenure. Well, one of the things that the provost of our university and many other provosts did pretty early on in the pandemic was added a tenure clock, voluntary. You had to apply for it, but applying for it meant they write their dean like me, can I please apply for the COVID-19 extension? Just automatically granted people a 1-year tenure extension. And, you know, some of the data that's been coming out, particularly there was a kind of an interesting piece written on the productivity of women economists compared to men economists during this pandemic, measured by, I think, papers submitted to one of the big, you know, economics white paper series, and they showed a pretty sort of dramatic difference between men and women. And the assumption, of course, is, and these are assistant professors, younger assumption is that the childcare duties were a result of this. And if you think about how that impacts a person's career long time, it can be pretty devastating. So thinking about ways, analogous ways in your own organizations to come up with the COVID-19 extension, which is what, what this university and other universities did, might be one way to at least begin to demonstrate compassion, but also, help people. And by the way, it's not, this didn't go to just women. It went to men and women, and any person who applied, essentially gets the COVID-19 extension if they want it. So thinking about equitable ways to do that too, I think is important.
Sarah, I love that example. And it reminded me, my sister, I was telling my sister earlier in my career that I really wanted to be an entrepreneur. And I knew that I could start a company, and I was scared that I was missing my window. And she said, women just need another 10 years. Like, we just have too many things overlapping to pull it off all at once. And I started BreakLine, I think I was 39. She was right. I just needed another 10 years to be in a position to be able to do it. So this question is an anonymous question, but I think it's a really important one. And it's one that we think about at BreakLine all the time, which is prestigious institutions and companies have been the most vocal about diversity, like in social media, and yet they tend to have the greatest racial disparities. Why do you think that is? And I'm going to add an addendum here. Why do we continue to tolerate this? Like, we now have years of data with very little changing. And at some point, we're working on it, reaction gets real old.
Yeah. There are so many reasons to answer this question. And I'm going to go back to something that I said earlier, which is a call for us to think about this moment that we are in right now, this incredible moment of where we're focusing. Yes, we're focusing on policing and what in many jurisdictions has been unequal policing of Black and Brown Americans. But let us not forget that is a lens to think about these broader issues. So, when we one of the things that always comes up at the Stanford as a prestigious university when we're hiring faculty is, well, why don't we have more faculty of color? We have not moved the needle on that. We've done actually reasonably well, especially over the last couple of years, in recruiting women faculty. But why do we fail again and again? And and I'm going to be very blunt here. I hope nobody minds. The convenient excuse, in my opinion, is the pipeline. The pipeline's terrible. And what I don't like about the pipeline argument, I'm actually not denying that. I mean, we do need more. We may need many more Black Americans. We need many more Latinx people. We need many more Native Americans to enter PhD programs. I totally get that, and that is true. But it behooves us to not just sort of say, oh, it's a pipeline. We need to actually fix the pipeline. And that's sort of, I think, what I'm sort of advocating, and again, in my own little narrow world of being a professor, that's what I'm advocating. So we are working on programs right now, for example, to bring underrepresented minorities into PhD programs. And so we have a program which we call the Research Fellows. They come as pre-docs. They spend 2 years with us. They work as research assistants and take some courses, and they get paid a salary to do this. And then we help them to get into PhD programs, elite PhD programs. And then, of course, my sort of like evil plan is that then they'll have such goodwill for us that they'll want to come back when they're on the job market as young assistant professors. We'll be able to recruit them back. So fixing the pipeline instead of throwing up your hands and saying the pipeline's the problem. Another one that I'm keen on that I haven't yet been able to start, but I want to start, is a postdoc program that is specifically for underrepresented minorities, so that they it's been 2 years getting a ton of research done, and then we hopefully hire them directly from the postdoc program. That's another one that I'm sort of keen on figuring out a way to craft. So one set of arguments is around throwing the hands up and saying the pipeline's broken. Well, then let's start figuring out ways to fix it instead of just making that excuse. Second thing that I think I'll throw out there, and this is something that we need to do more of, frankly, certainly at Stanford, but presumably other elite institutions too, are thinking about ways to not just do training, unconscious bias training, because that's important, but unconscious bias training without a change in culture doesn't work as well as it could. And so we need to figure out ways to both do more training so that people who are in positions of hiring, who are doing performance evaluations and so on, are aware of when their biases are creeping in and are able to figure out strategies for blocking bias. And so we need to figure that out, but then we need to make that part of the culture of how we work. I'll be honest, I know that we're not there at Stanford University, and you can see that in our numbers. The first step in this, last year, the university released a dashboard so you could look at student groups, student populations, undergrad, graduate, and so on, faculty, staff, and so on. So you could actually see the lack of diversity. That was the first step. And now I think we need to build on that momentum and begin to think about various ways of training, and then using our power, frankly, as a big, powerful, and wealthy institution to help do something to actually fix this, the pipeline problem, rather than just this, falling back on that. So I'm being very blunt with that, but that's some thoughts on it. And it's a really good question. And I thank whomever it was who asked it.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks for using Stanford as an example. Patrick Gutierrez has a really great question, Sarah, and I think you and I actually have also a little bit of a personal lens on this of why this is important. He says, what strategies can you share for building equitable and inclusive relationships with new teammates or customers you've never had the chance to meet in person? And I think that this is so important because the folks, in my view, who are going to have the toughest time on-ramping in this environment where everything is virtual are the folks who have not been lucky enough to be groomed for business from, day one, right? Part of what we teach at BreakLine are just the business 101, because, and one of the reasons why that's important to us is I had that experience of having no idea what networking meant or how to function at a cocktail party, or even that was a thing. And so there are all these unwritten rules that are even harder to figure out when you're not physically with people and able to kind of pick up on cues that they give you. So I really love this question from Patrick and would love to hear your perspective on it.
I love this question too. And I love this question because the way I like to think about this, and this is, I can't help myself because I'm an academic. I'm going to give you some terms too. When we often think about success, we think about things like, economic capital. So somebody's got some resources, some wealth, or somebody's, funded their venture or whatever. So economic capital, that one we totally understand. Then we think about social capital, and that one gets a little bit more, what's that mean? And Bethany just, sort of said exactly what she meant by that, which is, I didn't even know networking was a thing. Am I supposed to be networking? And social capital is nothing more than the networks that we need to help to pull us up. But the other one that Bethany hinted at, and I want to call out, is cultural capital, which is sort of the unwritten rules that some people seem to just kind of pick up throughout their lives, the kind of lucky folks who just seem to, have absorbed what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to act at a cocktail party, what, fork to eat with, and all of those other unwritten rules. And I think, and I've been sort of talking to some of our advisors at the GSB, I broached the subject, and then of course, the pandemic happened and we're not meeting them anymore. But when we were meeting them, that when we think about our mentoring of our students, our employees, we need to think about all three of those, because I think that oftentimes there's just this idea, well, we'll just, throw some money, give somebody a job, give somebody some funding, they'll have some resources. And maybe we get to the point, as Bethany said, where we teach, okay, well, we need to build this network. But the cultural capital stuff only really happens through, I think, these direct interactions. And so, I would sort of suggest to that, with this question, which I think is a really good question, how can you set people up directly with not just a mentor for sure, but also a sponsor. So somebody who they can have frank conversations with about all of these kinds of things, like, what's Zoom etiquette? Although I think probably most people have figured that out by now, but I don't know. I was on a couple of calls recently where I questioned the Zoom etiquette. But how do you, set somebody up so there's a comfortable relationship where they can talk about that, a mentoring relationship, but then it also becomes a sponsoring relationship. So it becomes such that, that Bethany is going to suggest my name to somebody for a really nice, promotion. Promotion or a new assignment, or Eric's going to give my name to somebody because he thought, oh, this might be somebody who would fit well with that assignment. So not just mentoring, like, oh, here, let me tell you what it's like around here and what you need to do to get ahead here, but also let me actually use my capital to help to find you plum kinds of assignments. And then one last thing I'm going to say too on this, it's a little bit off point, but it's a term that I recently learned from one of my colleagues at Stanford, somebody I do some diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And we often talk about mentorship and sponsorship as two different ways of helping others, but she uses the term micro-sponsorship. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard it, but think about this, right? So there's this way in which I may decide that I'm going to sponsor a young woman or a young Black woman by, making sure that she gets some interesting assignments and so on, and that's great. But that might be a big lift. And in this environment, when companies are retrenching, unfortunately, and jobs are being lost, it's hard to think about ways to do that. But there are ways that we can now, in this environment, engage in micro-sponsorship by small things that we can do to help say our Black employees or our Latinx employees or our women employees by simply saying, introducing them with the incredible skills that they have, as opposed to just letting them sort of, oh, there's another new person on the Zoom call, making sure everybody on the team really understands the unique skills and attributes that that person brings. So that mastering effective introductions so that everybody gets how important this person is to this role and to this organization. So I had to throw out micro-sponsorship because I'm liking that, particularly in this environment when, when we're not going to be doing, at least in the short term, a whole lot of hiring and promotions and so on. Oh, Bethany, I can't hear you.
Thank you. That was my Zoom etiquette getting in the way. I really love this point about shining a light on the unwritten rules. And Patrick, I think that this could actually be one key, because there are unwritten rules broadly in business, and then there are also kind of the local unwritten rules for each company. And I'm going to give you all an example of when this happened to me. One of the first times that I remember, it was when I was at Princeton, again, feeling very much like an outsider, but trying to like fake it till I made it. And somebody asked me to pass the salt, and I did. And they said, salt and pepper are always passed together. And it was like, wow, not where I came from, but whatever. But it was the first time where that was an unwritten rule, like in a certain class of people. And because I wasn't part of that class, I had no idea. It didn't even occur to me. So I think, Patrick, kind of thinking through that within Amazon, that is like actually gold from Sarah. I think that there could be something really interesting there. Sarah, we have one more minute, so I know we need to wrap up here. And Zane, my teammate Zane Knob and our breakliner Taj Shitu both have the versions of the same question. And I think that this is really important in the context of what you said about movements and really needing to have a concrete ask and a coalition to support. So with Black Lives Matter, right now there's a concrete ask with police reform, but as you suggested, there are so many more objectives that are really important that we could potentially capture together. And so, but we need a coalition really behind it to make that happen as part of the answer. And I think one party to this are companies, and in particular tech companies, which is where BreakLine focuses. And so for those companies, Zane's question is, what are the most important outcomes for companies to focus on when it comes to creating equitable environments and workforces? And Taj's version of this was also, how would you advise an organization fighting to achieve racial equality? So two lines that are really similar. I wonder if, as we wrap up, if you could share some thoughts with us.
Yeah. I think this is a great question. And it reminds me actually of something that I'm personally curious about, and I'm starting to collect some data on, and that's that in many companies, as we know, and many of your companies had leaders who issued BLM statements in the last month or so, and what I'm sort of curious about with those statements is what's happening internally in the organization to make sure that those just don't become empty statements that a fancy pants leader made in the heat of the moment. And a couple of things that I would sort of point to, I think, and first is measuring and disclosure. A lot of companies have disclosed they certainly started with gender, and now they're being much better. A lot of tech companies, I think, are leading the way, in fact, in disclosing and being transparent about what they need to do. So I think we really have to begin with getting our organizations to measure and then to disclose. And I don't think it's enough, personally, to just measure, to just disclose the numbers. We need to be internally looking at our data very, very carefully. Do we have any inequities in terms of salary, promotions, any other kinds of things that we might be able to collect data on and look at? Certainly many of our organizations have these data, but I'm not sure we're all doing what we need to do to look at those data, to study those data, and to be clear about where we need to make adjustments and where we need to fix them. It sounds so obvious. And I say it and it sounds like I'm Captain Obvious or something here, but I don't think enough companies are taking the task to do that and to do it as seriously as they should. Once they figured out that, we know a lot from the social psychology literature about where in the hiring process bias can creep in and how it can creep in. And so we need to think very seriously about reforming the way in which we do our hiring so that we can eliminate as much bias as possible in the hiring process. So we need to be thinking very carefully about that as well. I would love to see a world in which our tech companies within 5 years could be proud about their diversity reports and could say, we took this to task. We listened to the subtext and the not so subtle text of what the protests of 2020 were asking. And we took this upon ourselves to try to fix what we can do. I can make all kinds of other suggestions about internships, and I could make a lot of other suggestions about this. But I think Bethany, that's going to have to be another call. So you're going to have to invite me back.
Oh, we would love to do that, Sarah. And such a treat to spend this time with you, Sarah. Thank you for sharing your research with us and your perspectives with us. Thanks so much to the BreakLine community for showing up. Thanks for bringing your babies. We love to see them too. And thanks to Casey and the whole BreakLine team for helping us pull this off. Such a treat, Sarah. Really loved getting to spend the time with you.
Thank you. And thanks again for inviting me. And once again, to all the veterans on the call, it's an honor to spend some time with you. And thank you for everything that you've done for us.
Thanks so much, everybody. See you soon. Bye.